I'm going to send you home with this.
Oh, cool.
It's called Booksmart. Don't worry if these clips come out in case you peruse it. I put a clip wherever there was a neat chart. I think you're going to enjoy it.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure.
So I let's see what's going on over here. So I wanted to we can talk after class. We could maybe find a time, put a time in the calendar to learn. Yeah.
Okay.
If that works for you.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's see what's going on over here.
No.
Huh. Very cool. Okay.
This is Lamed Vav, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there are the Lamed Vavniks.
Yeah. Yeah. The hidden tzaddikim.
I think that was this subject of the book that I read many, many years ago. The Last of the Just. You ever hear of that?
No.
I can't remember, but it was I think it might have been a novel. I'll have to look into that. The Last of the Just.
Okay, well, let's get started. I actually saw Dwayne when I was driving over here. He was like parked. I don't know if he was on his way or what. So, chapter 36 and 37 sort of function together as talking about Mashiach. And the 35 is, I think he says over here in this little introduction, that in chapter 35, if we remember, the one of the first things that we addressed was this verse that we brought from Deuteronomy, right? That was written on the title page. It said, Kikar velecha hadavar ma'od b'ficha u'v'vavcha la'aseh, that is very close to you, it's very accessible to you. This thing, referring to, the corpus of Torah and mitzvahs, Judaism, b'ficha u'v'vavcha, in your mouth and in your heart, la'aseh, to do it. This is a verse in the end of Deuteronomy, as Moses is sort of giving the last push and the last vote of confidence to the Jewish people that you're going to go to Israel and, you can do this and you can crush it. And the question was, how to understand this idea of Kikar v'lecha, that it's so accessible and so close to us. And so after we've established that, so then the Alter Rebbe turns in chapter 35 to, okay, so let's understand this idea of la'aseh, to do it. What does it mean to do it, right? That Judaism is not just this worldview or a thought program or a mind program or a heart program, but that Judaism expresses itself most prominently and most distinctly in action. And so 35 is all about focusing on that action and the power that is in a single action, the action of a single mitzvah. I think I shared last week that I heard a story recently where there was a shliach who was, I couldn't remember if he was French or Canadian. I think I shared this last week, right? He spoke French. That's all. That was what I remembered. So either he was French or Canadian, and he went and he was running a high school, and he had a meeting with the Rebbe. He had a chiddush where he was complaining about how it felt like he would have these kids do 4 years in high school, and he said, and after they graduate, there's nothing left. It doesn't seem like anything sticks. And the Rebbe said, do I really have to tell you what it says in Tanya, that a mitzvah is eternal? You're a Chabad rabbi. I shouldn't have to explain this to you, So this is where these ideas come from. 35 really speaks to the eternality of a mitzvah from the mitzvah's perspective. And this is part and parcel with it being everything that we've said about the Torah being this bridge, this access point for us to engage with the infinite, right, via finitude, right? We have this principle that the Zohar tells us, that Hashem and the Torah are one, right? And that the Torah, while finite, contains. You want to?
It's okay. It's not making it past the door.
I'll get it.
He or she.
So we're talking about the eternality of a mitzvah and how one single mitzvah allows us to capture and to dial into the total infinity, right? The total infinite that is God Almighty, and how when it comes to the Torah, the way that the Tanya, the way that that Kabbalah and Chassidus sees the Torah as being the expression of God's will and God's wisdom, right? The articulation of that and the bridge, the access point to that. And being that God is totally aligned, totally unified with his will and with his wisdom, whereas for us, something like will or wisdom can be outside of us, it can be separate from us. And in that sense, it can also be subject to change. So for God, it's totally unified, and therefore when we do a singular mitzvah, we're accessing the entirety of that. That's the paradox of what it means to be in this physical world. And so further in that vein, what we're going to get to is the power of this physicality of what's accessible via doing a mitzvah, in fact allows us to realize the entire purpose of creation. Because ultimately what we're going to say is we have a sense in our experience, in our perception, that there is hierarchy, that there are higher realms and lower realms, right? That there is a more spiritual consciousness that we can inhabit and a more physically oriented consciousness, right? The spiritual would be what we call Atzilus, or the higher realms, and this physical world we call Asiya, the world of action. And what the Alter Rebbe is going to say is that being that the whole point is a finite realm, you might think that the spiritual realms are more important, but really the focus is this world. And that when we're able to engage godliness in this physical world via mitzvot, so what we accomplish and what we dial into is that essential relationship. And that is, on a cosmic level or on a macro level, that is what Mashiach is all about. Is each one of us collectively doing that together on a broad scale. So let's, again, I took on the last page, or on the last couple of pages, depending on which copy you have, but I put the Tanya, what did they call it? Tanya in plain English. So this chapter has it as well. which is nice because he translates some of the terms, and he sort of writes an essay on it and gets out of the jargon and out of the lingo that is much more Jewish and academic. And so, like last week, I think it's a good way to do some homework and to take it home and to reflect on everything that we learned tonight. So let's get started. On the bottom of the first page, B'nei mudaz zeis, Maimer Rizal, Shetachas B'ris Elam Hu, Shenazava Kadosh Baruch Hu Liyas Le'dir B'tachtenu. So it is well known. We have a tradition that identifies this teaching in the Midrash as being as encapsulating the essence of existence, and this is that the Midrash goes through sets up a whole idea of how history has unfolded, that the world was created in this sort of pristine, idyllic state in which, in the Garden of Eden, godliness was apparent, that we could live in a physical world. Adam and Eve, at least, were created in a world in which there was engageable, tangible godliness that was present within the limitations of the physical, finite realm. And then there were generations of retreat, right? Generations where that godliness walked itself back. It was removed from the equation. And then there was a process of bringing it back. And there's been a sort of limbo, or not a limbo, rather a sort of a push and pull and ebb and flow of certain generations that are able to integrate more godliness and make it more apparent, and then certain generations that push it away. But ultimately, all of this is under the premise that Nisava Kadosh Baruch Hu Liyas Le'dir B'tachtenu, that God created the whole system in place because he had this desire, this craving for a dwelling place in the lowest world. And that is when we look at the entire system of Chabad philosophy, it's all based on this concept. Everything sources itself back to this. Everything that we're trying to do and everything that we're trying to understand is all based on this medrash, based on this teaching. That it is no great, there's nothing novel about God being revealed or engaged with or accessible in spiritual realms, right? There's a spiritual dimension, and godliness is native there, right? It might be covered over, it might be concealed, it only might be, there might be degrees to which it is accessible, but it's still natural, and everything is oriented towards how much there is or is not. This world covers it over entirely. This world, a person can live 120 years and not think about God once, right? It's a function of the concealment that is present in this world. And this is specifically the revealing godliness, revealing the singularity within the multiplicity, the fragmentation of this world is the ultimate purpose, is the whole reason for creation.
I'm confused by a minor point. To make the home for God in this world through mitzvahs, which I guess is synonymous with unveiling.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Garden of Eden, had he not already determined on that program? Were Adam and Eve before the sin in perfect harmony and seeing God? And it makes me wonder, was this a later plan? Did the plan apply to them?
Yeah, so hold that thought.
I'm Rick.
Hey, Rick.
Well, I do elbow I'm sorry. What's your name?
Stanley.
Stanley, pleasure. So have you been coming to all the sessions?
I don't think I missed one. I was out of town.
My first read, so. Yeah, I'm here half the month, and so I missed the first two, and I had other stuff going on last week, so. I think I'll get 1 out of 5.
lot.
So I'm hoping that,
We
there's been
better address
recordings and-
everything. Yeah, it's all on YouTube. I've been emailing them to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, they're all on YouTube, and I'm going to make them available purely audio as well, God willing, as long as the audio comes out okay.
So I got a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so, there's the scientific cognitive side, and then there's the spiritual side. And I'm very evidence-based. So the evidence, in the world, indicates that the world is 5 billion years old, 4.5 billion years old, that, humans evolved through time, and that there were prior epochs and living things, and radioactive dating has, demonstrated that, stratigraphy has shown that. So I guess the question is Chabad's perception that the interpretation of Torah is basically allegorical or interpretive rather than fundamentalistic. So when we talk about Adam and Eve, for example, is it fundamental that, for example, the world is a few thousand years old, or does Chabad embrace the scientific world and what's been found?
So on one foot, and this is not any area that I have any type of expertise about, the short answer is that we definitely are fundamentalist,
Yes.
and that the Rebbe was adamant that 6 days of creation meant 6 days of creation,
Okay.
and that our calendar is correct and divine. There are lots of letters. He had a science background. He studied at the Sorbonne and the University of Berlin. He has a lot of letters addressing things like carbon dating and certain, schools of scientific thought. I don't feel comfortable speaking to that because I don't wrap my head around any side of it. What I will say is that there's two things. One is that when it comes to this conversation, it is, at least this specific conversation, it's, I would say, less relevant. And the other thing is that there is some, I would say, within the context of how we understand what our purpose is, which is really what this chapter and 37 are speaking to.
Sure.
It is our job and our goal is to look forward, and that while contextualizing and understanding our place in history is important, I think that what the Tanya is trying to accomplish is getting us to see past our own physical existence and orient towards something that is more spiritual, more divine, more singular.
Right. And actually, I would argue the same, that I think too many people who interpret the Torah in a very fundamentalistic way get wrapped up in that, in trying, sometimes you try too hard. And I think, however it's interpreted, my perception is that, Hashem lives outside of time. So whether it's 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years, doesn't matter. And so I don't necessarily think that the Torah and science are mutually exclusive.
Right.
So I'm more interpretive rather than fundamentalistic. And I think that the messages in Tanakh are what's important, and that the spiritual dimension is something totally different from what we encounter in the physical world.
Yeah.
And so if the basic message is to try to bring the spiritual domain into this physical world, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So So let's continue. So based on that, this idea is not just a fringe concept in Judaism, but is in fact really essential to what we're doing here. And this idea of dir b'tachtenim, a dwelling place in this lowest realm. And I didn't answer your question.
I was just thinking the same.
I read it all over your face.
Wait, I'm Rick. What's your name?
I'm Claire.
Claire, pleasure. And again, that you and Stanley have met. Okay, so this is my first day back. I haven't been able to attend any of the classes.
Okay.
So it's a pleasure.
So, Stanley, you asked if the system of mitzvahs was, yeah, did the plan change? The plan did not change. There is some reality that within the confines of time and space, I don't know if you would say that it changed or maybe it developed. It like got a new feature set. It seems that there are some sources that indicate that originally on the outset of creation, the plan was that the corpus of mitzvahs would apply to all people. And, focusing on the Jews was a later thing, right? After all these generations of people who were sort of missing the boat or missing the mark. And that there was some element in which originally everybody was going to have their opportunities for connection and they were going to look different. There's something that comes to mind, there's a teaching that comes to mind that is sort of obscure, but there's one school of thought that says that it's like we're gonna go in the weeds on this, but if you read the narrative and the story, the entire episode, it doesn't really match up. There's like a lot that is left to the sort of like a lot that's left to be desired because of the way God responds to what happened and the quote-unquote punishments that are in response to. And we read it as this sort of linear thing that like they did X and then God responds with Y. And that could be argued as as not necessarily a Jewish reading, and that there is a more holistic way to look at it, which is about Adam and Eve recognizing that they had a mission and a purpose, and recognizing that God doesn't put you in the place where you need to be. He'll take you to the door. And the function of us having free will is that we have to make that decision, right? Like God brought them to the border of Israel, and they had to determine, like, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to go in. And so similarly, Adam and Eve were sort of they were created as physical beings and were given this opportunity to live in a physical world with pain and suffering and the challenges that this world presents. And they had to choose that. And that's what the whole quote unquote sin was them taking that step into saying, like, we're ready for that difficult experience, for the pain of this world, because this is where it can be ultimately realized.
Do you mean to make it sound positive?
Yeah.
And I know that this is for another time, but there's the whole concept which I don't understand, hadn't had enough exposure to it. Adam Kadmon,
Yeah.
which complicates the whole thing in my mind.
Well, that's like a spiritual, that's like a Sphira Kabbalistic notion.
Adam had what, sorry?
There's a phrase, Adam Kadmon, which means primordial man. And is something that is mapped on the spheres. The spherot can be sort of understood within as having sort of different realms that apply to them and sort of different, like a hierarchy. And this is actually a good chapter to say that, like, there's a lot of hierarchy in Kabbalah and in mapping out worlds and realms and spaces of higher consciousness and lower consciousness, and we can get way in the weeds on it, and a lot of Kabbalah does, and it's a really holy study, obviously. But, like, there's also, in God's perspective, it's all sort of like ancillary. That the focus is physicality, and everything else is ancillary to facilitate the creation of this physical world. So it's actually the next line in this chapter. If we turn the page, so the first question we have is, we're saying that there's this Avakash Baruch Hu Liyas Leidid B'Tachtena means that God had a dwelling place to be in the lowest realm. The glaring question is at that point, so the lowest realm, I don't understand. There's no such thing as up and down, higher or lower by God, right? These are physical constructs that are irrelevant to a infinite, essential, singular essence, right? He fills all worlds equally. Everything is full of godliness. Everything only exists because of the godliness that is vitalizing it, that is animating it. And be they spiritual realms that express godliness apparently, or this physical realm that conceals godliness, that's ultimately entirely perspectival. It's all based on our perspective, that we see a hierarchy. We see things as more spiritual, more godly, or less godly. Ella, Birda, Indian. So let's explain. Let's try to understand a little. We spoke about this last week, that prior to the creation of the world, God existed in a totally singular form and filled all space, apparently, including this space that we're in now, where the physical realm exists, right? Which we would call the universe. And now that there's a universe, we don't see God expressly, right? We don't see it outwardly. So it would seem that in some sense, from our perspective, there was a change. But the fact of the matter is that by him, nothing changed. It's still the same. There's a universe now where there was just godliness before. For God, that's irrelevant. That's immaterial, right? Like we went deep into the metaphor, and or rather the analogy of the sunlight with the sun, right? And how when we're here on planet Earth, 93 million miles away, sunlight is a thing, right? It's something that we engage with. Whereas for the sun, sunlight is not a thing, right? When you're on the ball of the sun, when you're on the planet of the sun, you're not distinguishing, there's a ray and there's a ray and there's a ray and that's the sun, right? It's all one and the same. Down here, we see the sun and we see the sunlight, and they're two separate things. So for our perspective, something can exist, whereas for God's perspective, it can be totally immaterial, totally insignificant. So where's the change? The change is not by God, right? God is in some sense totally stagnant, right? Not dynamic in the sense that there's no change that affects him. But rather the change is something that we perceive something as the creations, as being on the receiving end. We perceive change. We live in a universe that is subject to the laws of time and space, and so the linearity of time and space means that we experience change.
You think that rather than call God stagnant, he's more of an immutable constant.
Yeah.
And but the question arises, why did God start all this to begin with? Because if God was everywhere and there's just light, what's the purpose for creating this universe, or perhaps other universes, and basically time all things within those universes to time, so that you're trapped in time, and then everything, all the dynamics that have since transpired. If the rationale is to ultimately create an environment that is sufficiently holy that God's presence may reside within those worlds. I mean, the world's been around a long time, and usually humans struggle with this and fall short. So again, what's the purpose?
So you hit the nail on the head. The purpose is to express that singularity, to reveal that holiness. What we're going to say is that we talk about these concepts, and we can be discouraged in thinking that they're far off, and thinking that a true radical change that is a messianic era, an era of peace and harmony and tranquility and apparent godliness, is something that sounds like a pipe dream and sounds like a utopian, a construct rather than something that could be real. But one of the things that the Alter Rebbe is going to say is that we've tasted it before. The moment of Matan Torah, the experience of receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai, was a microcosm of that reality, was a temporary experience of that same truth. And that just like the perfection and the idyllic state of Eden, and just like the reality of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Messianic era is the ultimate realization of that. But it's things that we've already experienced, things that we've already tasted, things that the world has already proven itself is a vessel for, that they're already relevant.
I kind of see it a little bit differently. I think that they're like punctuations in time that give a small glimpse of the presence of God. But that a lot of the time you strive, but invariably you fall short. And this life is an opportunity to strive, but continue to fall short, so that hopefully with time, one develops sufficient humility to see that you fall short of the presence of God. And that perhaps this life is really about acquiring a sense of humility.
That is, it's a fundamental characteristic.
And only when you have that humility could you possibly be receptive to being into the lower realm of the kingdom of God.
Right, because ultimately the hallmark of the Messianic era is for us to acknowledge each other and the godliness within each other, and that is predicated on true humility.
Right.
Okay. Where are we? The third line. So our experience here is, how is this realm that is so concealed, to which we are subject to the laws of time and space? So it's through these levushim, these various garments that conceal and hide and cover over God's light, the godly energy that is the source of all. Like God tells Moses that no man can see me and live. that similarly the angels, which are called chayas, which are literally means animals, but means energy, which means vitality, right? These things that are so in tune with the divine source that they're called energy, even they can't perceive it. And this is the Kabbalistic concept of Hishtalshalos. Hishtalshalos means, as they say here in the English, a chain-like graded and downward succession, means a chain-like descent. And one of the ideas that we talk about when we talk about Hishtalshalos is the terminology that we use to say that there is the expanse of creation that starts in the spiritual, that starts really sourced and rooted in God's expression, in the light. And then there is this entire system, this chain-like descent, where the light, where the energy of God's existence, of God infusing existence, of God's animus, becomes more covered over and more concealed. And you go down the chain till you get to this lowest world where the godliness is totally concealed. One of the ideas of that chain being that the nature of a chain is that while each chain link is only connected to its neighbor, ultimately on a sort of macro scale, we can say that each chain link, that even the lowest is connected with the highest, right? Because even though literally they're only connected with their neighbor, that series of connections spans the entire length of the chain. And that this lowest physical realm, even though it's totally covered over, it totally conceals, that divine energy is ultimately rooted in the highest source because of the nature of how chains work. And so this system of ishtalshalos, of drawing down godliness from realm to realm, covering it over more and more, is all for the purpose of creating this physical world, right? We might think that, God has spiritual realms and he has less spiritual realms and more spiritual realms, and then this is just sort of like an after the fact deal, right? Or we might think that maybe this is important, but really the goal is to just do our time here and then get to a spiritual realm, right? We got to put in our 120 years here, and then we can go to Ilam Haba, and then things will finally be good, right? But in fact, the essence of the Hasidic thought, the essence of what the Tanya teaches, is that the purpose of existence, the purpose of everything, is for us to sit here in Atlanta today and learn Tanya, right? The purpose of everything is for a physical world that we can connect to God through physical, not through thought, not through meditation, not through navel gazing, but by lighting Shabbos candles, by putting on tefillin, by giving tzedakah. In
Why
chapter,
does that work?
sorry?
Why and how does that work?
So,
Sorry.
A mitzvah, a physical mitzvah, is a connection point that allows us, that gives us the opportunity to connect to God's essence. Because of the paradox of this world, if we were spiritual beings like the angels, and we lived in a spiritual realm like the angels do, so we would have a limited, finite expression, finite engagement with godliness, however much is revealed. Right? However much is revealed is however much we could engage with, and that would be the nature of it, right? That's why our liturgy every morning goes through the experience of the angels, right? So you have the seraphim who say, Kadosh, 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 right? So they're looking up. Kadosh means separated, it means distinct, it means not here, right? They're looking up to this higher spiritual realm, and they're saying there's so much more godliness there, right? God isn't here, he's there, but we see Kadosh, 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 Hashem Alech Alav Kaved, that we see his glory, right? That we're still sort of engaging with the rays of his light, even though we're not accessing him himself, right? And then you have Baruch Kavod Hashem Kaimai. You have the next, the Chayas, which are lower angels, say they see even more the distinction. They see even more how far away God is from them and how they're just engaging with God's expressions, but the tremendous spiritual experience that engaging with God's expression still is. This is all the what's going on in the spiritual realms. All of that is fundamentally limited. All of that is however much you get is however much you get, right? We spoke about, when was it? Was it when it was either last week's class? Yeah, it was last week's class where we spoke about the idea of Olam Haba. Maybe it was on Sunday. This idea of Olam Haba, of there being a world to come, is all predetermined in some sense. Whatever a person's vessels are, whatever he's receptive to in the spiritual, that's what he experiences in the world to come. It's sort of pre-fashioned, right? You have a certain amount, your cup is only so big, which means you can only contain so much. What's radical and paradoxical about this physical world is that when you hold a physical mitzvah in your hand, when you give tzedakah, when you put on tefillin, when you blow the shofar, or you shake the lulav, you're taking something that is totally intertwined with God's essence because He and His will are one. So because the mitzvahs are an expression of His will, so therefore, and He and His will are one, so therefore it's an expression of His essence. And that the paradox of living in this physical world is that there are physical finite actions that can contain His will, right? Like the Gemara says that if God told us to chop wood, we would chop wood, right? Because the mitzvah means a connection. Mitzvah is a conduit for connection. And so every mitzvah that we do stands alone in its eternality because of its capacity for us to connect to the ultimate essence, the essence of God Almighty. It's not necessarily conscious, right? But one of the things about mitzvahs is that they are totally universal in the sense that nobody does a mitzvah any differently. The same tefillin that you put on, and the same tefillin that Stanley put on, and the same tefillin that I put on, and the same tefillin that Moshe Rabbeinu put on, right? And there's no difference in a hierarchy of somebody who's more spiritual does the mitzvah different than somebody who's less spiritual. It's a one-size-fits-all, right? We all shake the same lulav. Some communities, they add extra hadassim. Some communities add extra aravas, right? The myrtle or the what's the aravas in the willows, right? But at the end of the day, everybody does it. They have palm and myrtle and willows and a citron, right? And the number might be different, but the essence of the mitzvah is the same. We all blow the same shofar, right? Some people have a longer shofar, some people have a shorter shofar, but it's all the same. And the mitzvah is in that connection. And in that sense, everybody does the same mitzvah because they have this universal element to it. They have this element that cannot be contained, that it's not user-defined. And that's because of its capacity, its ability to be a conduit for us to connect to God's essence.
So, and I used to attend Rakshal about 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And my best friend was Chabad, from Chabad. And there was a contrast because he would do the mitzvah, so he perceived as a good Jew, but then he would do things that were in contrast, paradoxical to the mitzvah. And so I think one of the challenges for Jews is that there's this rationale that it's sort of like a particle or recipe. You do this and this and this and this, and you're good to go. Whereas my perception of it is whatever mitzvot you do should be impelling you to live a more high-minded life with humility and kindness. And that ultimately it's humility and kindness that is the directive. And if the mitzvah is that connection with God that impels you to be more godly in your life in this realm, then that's the ultimate goal. Now, is that something that Chabad also agrees with?
I don't want to be labeled as the spokesman for Chabad, and
that's okay.
I would say that ultimately that the essence of the mitzvahs is that they stand alone, and that in as much as it might be difficult for us to see somebody who is, outwardly quote unquote observant, who is, when it comes to his morals and ethics, maybe lacking. It doesn't. It's apples and oranges, right? The fact of the matter is that we stand on the belt line and put on tefillin with people, and we're not asking them to do anything other than the one mitzvah. It doesn't matter if you came from McDonald's, or you're on your way to McDonald's, or you're going to some other place, or doing something horrible, terrible. The mitzvah stands alone in that moment, and so it's unaffected by whatever a person is carrying with them, or wherever a person is going before and afterwards.
It should not be perceived as a mechanism.
Yeah. What I will say is that, for somebody whose morals and ethics are, tenuous, just imagine if they didn't have all the mitzvahs, maybe the mitzvahs are what's keeping it to only be tenuous, But I think that in as much as, the presence that we have and the intentionality that we can bring to doing a mitzvah that can really elevate us to a place where we are more thoughtful and more considerate and more humble and more kind, and that in a lot of ways that is what the entire system of Judaism is about. I wouldn't say that the mitzvahs are a means to that. The mitzvahs are an end in and of themselves because they facilitate this relationship with God, this connection with God. I think for a person who is present to his connection with God and is using the mitzvahs as an opportunity to reflect on his relationship with God, will, be overcome with a desire to work on his humility and work on his intentionality and his presence, We talk about things like, an example that I like is that we all have mitzvahs that we think make sense and are within our wheelhouse, and then we think that there's things that are like too far and too fundamentalist and just too wacky, And if you open up a Shulchan Aruch, if you open up the Code of Jewish Law, one of the first things that is discussed is how you tie your shoes. And it's like a common example of like, oh, that's like really crazy Judaism, right? Like, God doesn't care how I tie my shoes, like, just leave me alone, But when we think, and obviously it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah how to tie your shoes, right? This is like a later development. But if we treat everything as an opportunity for meditation, and you dig a little deeper as to where the system comes from for how to tie your shoes, it's all built around tefillin. It's all built around a meditation in tying, which is what tefillin is all about. And so it's a meditation on the right versus the left, which Kabbalistically is about kindness versus discipline or restraint, and that you put on your right shoe first, and then you put on your left shoe, but then you tie your left shoe first because we tie the tefillin on our left arm, and then you tie your right shoe to give this whole ultimate deference to the right side, to kindness over severity, and to focus always on the kindness and to emphasize the kindness, and that we have the inverse when we take off our shoes, right? And all of this can just be like, wow, Judaism's wacky, or it can be, this is a meditation, and that in something so simple like tying my shoes, I can reflect on my relationship with God. And that's where we're trying to get to. That's where those mitzvahs help us to really live on a higher plane. Okay. Turning the page. And so this world is the lowest world. And being that it is the lowest world, that's how we know that it is the purpose, right? If there were a lower realm, then that would be where it was meant to be, right? God says, I want a dir b'tachtenim, I want a dwelling place in the lowest world. So then we have to look at, okay, so what's the lowest world? This world is the lowest world. Why is it the lowest world? Because this is the world where it's full of fragmentation. It's full of, the Kabbalistic terms are klipas and sitra achra. Klipas are the shells that cover over godliness, and sitra achra means the other side, the side that is not connected with holiness, the side that is not connected with godliness, the side that opposes that singularity, that essentiality, that alignment, to the point that you have a world full of everything saying ani ba'afsiyad, right? That it's me and just me, right? That each thing expresses its own individuality. Each thing is a protuberance sticking its head up and saying, I'm self-made and I'm the whole reason why everything is here, right? That in some sense the chair says it, in some sense the rock says it, and in some sense we all say it, right? We all struggle with that sense of ego, that sense of hubris that tells us that we're self-made, right? The Torah tells us, the Torah has a whole account where Moshe Rabbeinu is admonishing the Jewish people, and one of the things that he says is, don't say, Kochi va'etzim yadi, asali es a chayil ezeh. Don't say to yourself that I'm self-made and I amassed for myself this fortune, right? Don't think that you're the one who's making for yourself the money, right? It's all from God. It's all part of a bigger cosmic system, and we're on the receiving end of that. We're just trying to get out of our own way. We're just trying to dial into our soul, dial into our nefesh elikis, our godly spark, and to move our misaligned sense of self, our ego, out of the way so that can shine through a little bit. So therefore we can see that this entire system of creation is not for these higher realms, is not for these more spiritual realms, because for them, right, being that they're still spiritual, being that they don't have physicality, in some sense they're just a descent for God. They're just if godliness is about this expression, this outward exuding of light, of expressing and sharing the singularity, if that's God's like MO, so then the spiritual realms are just covering over that. They're just limiting that, some more, some less, right? Because there's a spectrum, but they're all just limiting it to some degree. It's only in this physical world where, in it being totally covered over, that it actually makes room for something else. It makes room for us in our own finitude to dial into, to experience, and to connect with God in a radically different way. Allah hatachlis hua ilm haza hatachton. On the last line, the tachlis is, the purpose of it all is this physical world, is what we do now in this physical world, is the ways that we connect now. Shekach olah b'ratzoni yisbarach, because this was the whole reason why he created all of it. He didn't create it for there to be angels and for there to be spiritual realms, right? We know there's a number of teachings in the Talmud where the angels approach God and say, why are you giving your Torah, your most prized possession, why are you giving it to the Jewish people? And the famous one is a teaching in the Talmud where Moshe Rabbeinu interjects and says, do you have parents that you have to honor? Do you have a weekly schedule that you have to keep Shabbos? Right? The purpose of all of it is this physical world and what we do in this physical world. Shekach olah b'ratzoni yisbarach li is nachas ruach lefonav yisbarach, because this is the source of pleasure, this is the source of connection for the divine, is for us to be finite and for us to connect, to go, to transcend the limitations of our finitude, not to cease to be finite, but to be in a finite form, to be in a physical body, and to push ourselves to be a little more refined, to be a little more, to go that extra mile to connect. Based on a teaching from the Kabbalah, from the Zohar, which says that when one subjugates the Sitra Achra, when one subjugates the side that is not connected with holiness, which in practical matters, so iskafia is often used as a term for like the famous story. I think I've mentioned it here before. There was a rabbi in France who ran a yeshiva, and he would say, "I understand that you have bread, and I understand that you have butter, but do you really have to put the butter on the bread?" Like that was too indulgent for him, and that was too over the top. And so iskafia is used to this idea of like avoiding indulgence. They would say what's prohibited is prohibited, and what's permissible is what's the expression is unnecessary, right? So obviously something that's not kosher is not kosher, but that which is kosher, there's a way that we can engage with it that is uplifting, and there's a way in which we can engage with it, to your point, in a lot of ways, that the Ramban talks about a manufal b'reshus Torah, a lowly person with the permission of the Torah, is somebody who takes all the kosher meat and all the kosher wine and sits down and eats like a total glutton, right? That there is an ethos that is not necessarily expressly written in how we operate and how we conduct ourselves, that speaks to the ultimate purpose of what we're doing here. In our generation, it's interesting because in generations past, iskafia was a very intense system of limiting how much you ate and limiting, the different physical pleasures and experiences. And in our generations, it doesn't really speak to our experience so much. Though, things like intermittent fasting are now a thing, so we're sort of a little more aligned in some ways than maybe we give ourselves credit. But it was in the early years, I think it was in like the late 50s, somebody asked the Rebbe, what's iskafia for our generation? And one of the things that he said that I've always been struck by was he said that it's the ways in which we relate to time. That do we use out the time that we have responsibly and effectively, or do we just let time go by, right? Are we disciplined in how we use time? Is 5 minutes just 5 minutes, or is 5 minutes a whole world, an opportunity for connection, an opportunity to get something done? They tell a story about one of these big rabbis in Israel, and he finished the whole Talmud, and he made a siyum on the whole Talmud, and a week later, or like 10 days, maybe 2 weeks later, he made another siyum. And they were like, I don't understand, you just finished the whole Talmud, 63 tractates. You just finished it last week, 2 weeks ago, how did you finish it again? So he said, that was my regular study schedule. I just finished a different study schedule I had where I would learn a couple of lines every time I was waiting for the bus. And that one was going on for many years, but I finally finished that one too, right? It was just a few minutes here and there, but over 40, 50, 60 years, it adds up to be a whole lifetime of study.
How do you translate iskafia?
To subjugate. In modern Hebrew, it would be lichfot, is to force or to pressure. So it's in a sort of Aramaic reflexive term. So it's like to self-force or to self-control. Sheyar Ar Hashem Ensof Baruch Hu b'mokem ha'cheshech v'asitra acher shel kol ha'elam kulei hazeh v'yasasas v'yasar az v'yisrayin ar abba min ha'cheshech v'arase be'elam esal. Because it is in this darkness that the light is the brightest, is the most transformative. Shemer Sham Al Yidei Levushim Vester Ponim Hamastirim Ma'alim Ha'ransav Baruch Hu Shelo Yivatum Tzias. Right, because in higher worlds, the light is apparent. right? The light is the light of godliness, the energy that is illuminating, is present and is engageable and is conscious. It's part of their conscious experience. That's why they're saying all day, Kaddish, 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 right? Because they're engaging with it. It's illuminating their existence. And for us living in this world of total darkness, where the godliness is totally covered over, it is here that when we illuminate ourselves through something like Iskafia, through intentionality and how we relate to time, or, the other thing the Rebbe said was eating healthy, which I thought was interesting. And I actually heard once somebody said that meant, for our generation, eating organic. One time heard that at a Farbrengen.
In other words, be responsible in the way that you live in all ways.
Yeah, yeah. But for us, because the world is so totally covered over, so therefore what it creates is that the light becomes totally transformative, so bright in comparison. And it is for this reason that God gave us the Torah, shenikras kayach va'ez v'kayach, right? Because it is called might and strength. Similarly, this Shabbos is we finished the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, and when we finish every book of the Torah, we say Chazak, Chazak, v'nis chazek, strong, strong, may we be strengthened, because the Torah is our source of strength. That God gives the tzaddikim strength to receive the schar and the world to come. How much do we have left? We have a couple more minutes, right? If anybody has to go, I won't be offended. I try not to go past 8:30, but I'm enjoying this. The strength is for them to be anchored within themselves, to be connected within themselves, and not to lose themselves within the light of God, to not be overwhelmed and consumed within the spiritual. The Torah is that anchor. The Torah helps us integrate in ourselves God consciousness in a way that it is not overwhelming, that it is not all-consuming. The pasuk says that you will no longer, your teacher will no longer be concealed from you. And your eyes will perceive your teacher, that they shall see eye to eye, and that the sun will no longer be your light, because God will be your light. All of this is to say that the light that is shining forth in the world to come is not concealed, is not covered over, but is present. So the question is, at that point, we're saying everything is for this world, right? We're saying that the entire purpose of existence is for this physical world, but that it seems that the realization of purpose and the revelation of godliness is only something that happens in the next world, in the spiritual realms. So how do we square those two? Right? If it's for this world, then we should be able to realize godliness in this world. And if godliness is only apparent in the spiritual world, so then it would seem that it's for that spiritual world. So in what realm can it be realized here in this world, within the confines of the physical, and be totally realized within the physical, right? This is what we're saying, that ultimately the Messianic era is about all of physicality expressing this singularity within, while staying physical, as opposed to being transformed into something spiritual. The radical essence of what Mashiach is about is for it to remain physical, is for it to remain finite, and within that finitude express something infinite, express something godly, right? So it's known that the Messianic era, and specifically the time in which we refer to as Tchias HaMesim, when the dead will be revived, this is the ultimate purpose, and this is the total realization of godliness. The time of the reward is the 7th millennium. The reward, the total aligned state of Mashiach is something that happens in the 7th millennium, as the Arizal teaches us, as Rabbi Isaac Luria teaches us. This speaks to the ultimate purpose, but this is something that we've already experienced, that we've already had a taste of at the giving of the Torah. Like it says, Ata haresa ladas, that you have shown to know. That there was an experiential dimension, a conscious experience that we could call, that would fall under the category of vision, that was what was present at Mount Sinai, right? The Torah tells us, that they saw the voices, right? They saw the audio of what was happening at Mount Sinai. There was a harmony between visual and audio that was present at Mount Sinai, that the limitations of the physical and of each finite thing, right? That audio is different than video or visual, right? And that they're two separate realms that can't be married, that can't be interrelated or interchanged, but there was the harmony that was created at the moment of the giving of the Torah, harmonized those two in a way that there was some sort of interaction and some sort of inter-exchange between the two of them.
In other words, the crossing of the beams.
Yeah. Haresa mamish b'riyah chushis, and they literally saw, right? Or haresa, that you made yourself seen, that they literally saw godliness, whatever that means, right? It's something that's hard for us to conceive of. They saw that which was heard. That they looked eastward while they were standing at Mount Sinai, and they saw the words, the audio, the sound waves coming out saying, Anechi, I am the Lord your God. And in fact, not only was it east, but in every direction, right? In some sense, harmonizing all ends of the compass and all directions of physical, of finitude, they all expressed that same singularity. Like it says in the introduction to the Zohar, that there was no place where they did not speak from him. There was no space where the sound, where the audio didn't emerge from, didn't emanate from. Because the Ten Commandments are this total synthesis, this total revelation of God's will. Shein Klolos HaTorah, like we know that there's this principle of 10 commandments contained within them, the entire Torah. And we know that the entire Torah is the essence of God's will and His wisdom. And there can be no concealment there. Like it says that within the light of your countenance, you have given us the Torah of life. This is something that we say in the liturgy, in the Sim Shalom blessing at the end of the Amidah. And therefore, the experience at the Sinai experience was one that was totally bonkers. It was one where we went out of our limitations, right? Where the tradition says that the Jewish people died, and then God brought them back to life, and then said the next commandment, and then they died again, and then He brought them back to life. And they said, no more, this is too much for us. And every divine utterance, their soul left their body. right? When we think about in the dichotomy of body and soul, right now the way it works is that the intensity that is the concealment of the body is able to anchor the soul, right? There's something that the strength of the body is able to anchor the soul and sort of contain the soul. And so when the body's weakened, then the soul goes above, right? So if the body, that can happen after 120 years, it happens from old age or from sickness, God forbid, we shouldn't know of such things, but it happens, it was happening here as well because it was such an overwhelming, intense experience that the body wasn't able, the soul was so enlivened, was so dialed in, the body wasn't able to contain it, so the soul just went above. But rather, God used this dew. Dew has the Kabbalists are obsessed with dew. Dew is magical and fascinating for the Kabbalists, and there's something beautiful about the way it sort of appears and sort of presents itself in the dark of night and in the early hours of the morning, right? It just sort of shows up and is the perfect amount. There's never too much dew, right? Rain is a blessing, but it can also, if there's too much rain, it can be almost the opposite of a blessing, right? But dew is always like, it's just like lightly moisturized, it's so the Kabbalists are obsessed with dew. So the tradition is that there's a dew, Tal Torah, the dew of Torah is this conduit, is this facilitator for reviving the dead when Mashiach comes. That it says that anyone who engages with the Torah, the dew of the Torah revives him and animates him, gives him this vitality, right? We experience a taste of Mashiach when we learn Torah. The Torah is not just merely an academic pursuit, and it's certainly not any type of navel gazing, but it is something that trains our mind and elevates our consciousness to experience a microcosm of that messianic reality, of that tranquility and that harmony that is the ultimate purpose. Right, but after the giving of the Torah, so they had a sin. They lost their way and they lost their focus and their purpose, similar to what we're talking about when it comes to the Garden of Eden. So this is another story that presents itself as a sin, though maybe can be understood in a different way. But it was a challenge for the Jewish people, and it won't be we're still working towards realigning the world ad ke eis ketz hayamin, till the end of days, till the end of the right hand, which we spoke about last time, when the right side will be revealed, right? We live in a world, we're talking about the right versus the left when we're putting on our shoes, right? The right is all about kindness and the left is about severity and intensity and restraint. And we live in a world of intensity and restraint and severity. We live in a difficult world, a world of challenges. And so the Messianic era is connected with the right side, whereas this world is connected with the left side. And so the hope is to get to the right, to reveal that kindness, and that kindness should supersede over the severity. And at this point, the physicality will be totally refined. And the Torah is the conduit for us to reveal our physicality, and ultimately the purpose is for us to be in a physical body, and for our physical body, right, just like we're saying that all finitude, all material existence will express something infinite, so the body will be the ultimate expression of the infinite, right? The body will be the ultimate expression of godliness in this reality that is totally aligned, that is totally harmonious. Right, because the body has the ultimate capacity in that it is the home for the soul, right? So it has the greatest capacity to reveal the most godliness. It just covers over the most right now. And it will light up not only the Jewish people, but it will light up all nations of the world. That the Goyim will walk by your light. There will be an integration and a harmony between all peoples of the world, and all people will be illuminated, all people will be connected with God. that house of Jacob, go and we will walk along by the light of God, that there will be a harmony amongst all peoples. The Schenectady. How do you say it? Synecdoche.
Synecdoche.
Yeah.
What was the example of that?
V'ro kol basar yachdav, and all flesh will perceive godliness.
Oh.
This is the verse we were talking about. Uksiv love b'nikras hatzurim uv'sifei asloim mipnei pachad avai v'adar geinei, and to enter the holes of the rocks and the clefts of the boulders, to that every space, just like we were saying when the Torah was given, the sound emanated from all spaces. So the same is true. V'chein sha'emrim, and similarly we say in the Machzor, we say in the High Holiday Liturgy, V'ayfa ba'adar geinei zecha al kol yesh v'sevel artecha, appear in the majestic splendor of your might over all inhabitants of the world, including the other nations, that there should be a harmony amongst all people, and with that harmony and all people being together, there will be a sense of purpose and a sense of connectedness, that we all are expressions of godliness and are all connected to our source, to our Creator. There's a short essay that I found referring to chapter 37, which continues this conversation. Chapter 37 is a monster. It's a huge chapter. It's not a monster. It's gargantuan. It's a behemoth, right? That's a little more in tune with the biblical. The messianic perfection and the resurrection of the dead, which are the revelation of the infinite in the heart of the finite, depend entirely upon you and your spiritual practice. When physically engaged in spiritual practice, the shells of separation are made transparent, and the light of God illuminates the darkness of self. You are not here to elevate the spiritual, but to illuminate the material. Illumination happens whenever you eat, drink, or do all that you do in a state of holiness, in a state of connection. The greatest illumination comes through generosity, comes through tzedakah, which is called the quintessential practice. The Alter Rebbe says that it's referred to as the mitzvah. Generosity, tzedakah, is giving from the fruits of your labor and requires all of your energy. Your entire body gives and uplifts it. This is why generosity hastens redemption. The Talmud tells us that that it brings closer this messianic era because it uplifts those around us. It creates a connection between us, between the giver and the receiver, and it's something that we do with all of our existence, with all of our body, with all of our everything, and we give it to somebody else, and it incorporates all of their everything, right? Just like each one of us, we all work, and when we work, we generate money, and that money represents all that we do, and then when we share that money with somebody who's less fortunate, and we help them elevate themselves, help them get out of a situation, help them reach a higher strata upon which to live, so we're using all of our existence to uplift all of their existence. So that is the essence of Mashiach. That is that's what 37 addresses. That's something for us to think about, each one of us in our own way in these times, these 3 weeks as we get ready for the 9 days, which are a time that has historically been very difficult for the Jewish people. But it gives us the opportunity in that darkness to bring in so much more light when we commit ourselves to giving tzedakah or to doing a mitzvah with some regularity, with some more regularity maybe than we've been doing, each one of us on our own level, focused most importantly on growth. So thank you everybody for coming. I really enjoyed tonight's conversation. And next week we're going to talk about radical acceptance and integrating a sense of God's divine plan practically into how we see our physical, our material, our day-to-day life. And that'll be it for this series of Tanya, because the 6th class is getting bumped for Tisha B'Av. God willing, Mashiach will come and we can cancel this whole Tisha B'Av deal because I'm pretty sick of it myself. And then when we do that, we can have our class. And we'll do it in Israel, God willing.